Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the opening lecture for the 2021 Virtual Bulb Show. My name is Tim Johnson, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the Botanic Garden of Smith College. While we cannot meet in person, I'm grateful that you are joining us today. It's been a challenging year, and I want to acknowledge that it's been a particularly challenging few weeks for many of us in the local Northampton community and in the global Smith College community. While Lyman Conservatory remains closed to the public, students are back on campus, adhering to strict community protocols. A reminder that updates and information about Smith's Culture of Care Response Plan can be found at smith.edu. Although this year's bulb show is virtual, it is just as much work to bring it to life. Our horticulture team began planting and vernalizing thousands of bulbs in October of 2020. Through a carefully choreographed dance, oftentimes taking multiple tries to figure it out, each specimen receives exactly what it needs to bloom for this special moment for your viewing pleasure. I would like to thank those who have made this show possible. Dan Babineau, greenhouse horticulturalist and show producer, and our student assistants, Mackenzie Swart, Ada Comstock Scholar, class of 21 bio major, and Bridget McNeil, class of 21 study of women and gender major. I would also like to thank the following people for their contributions to this year's show and tonight's lecture. Pamela Dodds for web development, social media, and communications, and tonight's virtual event manager, Maria Douglas, working behind the scenes. Thank you, Maria. Thank you also to our members, donors, friends, alumni committee, and well-wishers who have cheered us on through the pandemic. A year ago, on March 10th, 2020, Smith College made the painful and necessary decision to send students home as the COVID-19 pandemic landed in Western Massachusetts. We were 3 days into the 2020 Bulb Show, our largest event of the year. We received only positive, understanding encouragement. The vast majority of our members and donors have stayed with us while being unable to set foot in Lyman Plant House. Your support is invaluable, and you make so much possible. For those of you not yet members, I hope you will join the community that holds us up by becoming a member. You can join right now by visiting garden.smith.edu/give. The virtual bulb show will officially open this Saturday, March 6th, with a live stream of the show, video tours, and plenty of flower pictures, as well as a recording of tonight's talk. To view the virtual bulb show, visit garden.smith.edu and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Finally, I want to introduce Manager of Education, Sarah Loomis, who will be introducing our speaker. And I also want to thank her for bringing tonight's event to life. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Tim. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Loomis. I'm the Manager of Education at the Botanic Garden of Smith College. And I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Desiree Narango as our first ever virtual bulb show speaker. Dr. Narango is an ecologist who studies how birds, bees, butterflies, moths, and other wildlife use novel landscapes significantly altered by people, such as urban forests, residential yards, and farmland. Her research also focuses on understanding and quantifying interactions between plants and animals as a means to inform plant selection and restoration. Her ultimate goal is to find data-driven conservation solutions for land managers to help preserve biodiversity and species interactions in a rapidly changing world. Dr. Narango is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the biology department at UMass Amherst and a 2020 David H. Smith Conservation Research Fellow. Her current research focuses on understanding habitat and diet relationships of insectivorous migratory birds using urban and urbanizing forests in New England. I can say on a personal note, she is a joy to speak with. Every time we talk, I learn something new. I think she has just this wonderful ability of infusing some optimism into these topics that can sometimes feel overwhelming and perhaps even a little discouraging. As she says, our gardens actually matter. those simple choices you're making in your yard are not just creating beautiful scenery for you to look at, your garden can be ecologically functional too. Desiree will speak just about 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A as moderated by Tim. You can type your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen, but we're asking that you wait till the end of her presentation to use that. We will get to as many questions as we can. And as a final reminder, as Tim said, this will be recorded and we will be sharing it out through our YouTube channel, but we will announce it at our website, which is garden.smith.edu. So without further ado, Desiree, I will now turn this over to you.
Great. Oh, thank you so much for that introduction. That was wonderful. And thank you everyone for being here and tuning in virtually. I'm really just incredibly grateful to have this opportunity to have the Bulb Show go forward and give this opening lecture to you. And I'm so excited to share with you just a little bit about what some tiny birds have taught me about native plants and our urban and suburban ecosystems. And I hope that after this lecture that you will go home with at least a little bit of information that'll help you take that personal conservation action through the way that you cultivate plants in your private gardens. So without further ado, I'm ready to chat and let's get going here. So yeah, so as Sarah said, a lot of my research focuses on novel landscapes and human-dominated ecosystems, which, if you think about it, are basically everywhere because we have completely and dramatically transformed the world to support a growing human population. And with that comes real cascading impacts for habitat quality for wildlife. But we're also facing dramatic losses of biodiversity around the globe, and importantly, extinction of nature experiences in every generation of our kids. And so our grand challenge as conservationists, as members of the global public, is to really ask the question of how can I share the world with biodiversity while simultaneously supporting people and also inspiring them to care. And so as an ecologist, I would argue that we can't have successful conservation unless we incorporate our privately managed land. Currently in the United States, more than 60% of it is considered privately owned. And there's some estimates for the lower 48 United States that 10 to 15% of that is considered residential areas alone. And in urban and suburban areas where habitat is very, very limited, our yards are making up the majority of the available green space. And so if we really want to improve these areas for biodiversity, we need to, of course, study them and try to understand them so that we can provide the information to help you in your day-to-day decision-making. And so that's really where I come in. That's where all my research is about, is trying to help you make those decisions. And right now is really just ripe for big conservation action that everyone is involved with. The UN has stated that the 2020s are the decade of ecosystem restoration. And our current administration has even proposed that 30% of our country will be protected, restored, and conserved by 2030. But honestly, these are lofty, ambitious goals. And it's really my opinion that our urban and suburban yards and green spaces are really an important part of our solution for conservation and restoration. And increasingly, we are seeing stories of conservation success that includes residential yards. From the Atala butterfly that was presumed to be extinct, showing up in gardens because people were planting the plants that they need, endangered orchids and other species in Miami, are threatened rusty-patched bumblebees showing up in gardens in Minnesota. We've even have wood thrush that are nesting in yards in Boston, Massachusetts. And with an increased interest in wildlife-friendly landscaping practices, I'm really, like Sarah said, I'm optimistic. I really am optimistic that we will keep seeing these kind of successes. But we know when we go out and we look at yards that not all yards are supporting these species. Probably the majority of the yards are not supporting these species. And so we really need a better understanding of what are the specific features and mechanisms that lead to this high quality habitat for wildlife. And so one of the primary ways that people can personally manage land is through the way that they cultivate plants. And from the trees that were cut down when your neighborhood was developed, the ones that you planted to replace them, the designer gardens that you've created, how many single times that you mow in a season, each one of those seemingly small decisions has had the additive effect of completely transforming the composition of the plant community that has survived to occupy the present day. But truthfully, we know surprisingly little about what those sort of changes and plant selection, what those sort of changes have on wildlife, even though that these changes could have really important implications for wildlife habitat and species interactions. And so in the beginning of my talk here, I just want to share with you a little bit of evidence for why the plants that you select might matter from the perspective of our pollinating insects. And so some of you in the audience may already be familiar with the monarch butterfly, who will visit lots of different flowers for nectar as an adult. But when it's in its larval form as a caterpillar, it feeds exclusively on milkweed leaves. But what you may not realize is that over 90% of our plant-eating insects are specialists to some degree. And the reason for this is that these insects have adapted over evolutionary time to feed on very particular host plants for which they've overcome those nasty defensive chemical compounds that are found in the leaf, but they also adapt to the timing of that plant, such as when it leaves out. And as well as the morphology or the shape of that plant as well. And so a really great example of this that I love is this double-toothed prominent that I'm showing to you here, which is a specialist of elm trees. That's the only plant that it'll feed on. And it also blends in really nicely with the double-tooth morphology of the elm leaf as well. And so we can see tremendous examples of this specialization in our insect community. So I'll share just a couple of them for you right now. So entomologists, the scientists that study insects, are very convenient. They like to name species based on what plants that they need. So here, our juniper hairstreak is this gorgeous, beautiful green butterfly. It's a juniper hairstreak because it only feeds on plants from the juniperous genus, such as red cedar. And so you can see in this picture of the caterpillar here, it blends in really nicely with the scaly leaf of the juniper. And then it grows up, it becomes a butterfly. And then as a butterfly, it'll feed on lots of different flowers, like it seems to prefer mountain mint, especially. Specialism doesn't mean one plant to one species of insect. So here is our snowberry hummingbird moth. You may have heard of hummingbird moths. They come to visit your flowers. Lots of people like to plant phlox because the adults will come to them. But as a caterpillar, they feed on a handful of different kinds of plants, such as native bush honeysuckle and vine honeysuckle, dogbane, about 4 or 5 genera of plants this caterpillar can feed on. But if you think about all the different plants that are out there in the landscape, it's really just a fraction of the plant community that's available that this particular hummingbird moth needs. We also can see specialization that's regional. So this is the eastern tiger swallowtail, a very common butterfly that you may have seen fluttering around in your backyard. Up here in New England, they really like cherry trees. So you can find females laying their eggs on cherry trees so the caterpillars can grow up and eat them. If you travel down to the mid-Atlantic, such as Maryland or Delaware, the eastern tiger swallowtails really like tulip tree and ash trees. Even though ash trees are up here, they just don't use them as much as they do in the mid-Atlantic. And if you kept going south to South Carolina or Georgia, these eastern tiger swallowtails are using sweet bay magnolia. And so even though this butterfly is considered a generalist because they can use dozens and dozens of different plants for the whole national population, at a regional level, there are particular plants that they specialize on. And then just to give some love for my moths here, here's our rosy maple moth, which as you might expect is using maples. But even among the maple genus, which has lots of different species, both native and non-native, the rosy maple moth really likes sugar maple. And so you need to have really healthy populations of sugar maple if you want to have healthy populations of this gorgeous pink moth. And if you're wondering if I'm just showing you a beautiful picture of one moth, I can assure you that there are tons of moths that are gorgeous and amazing creatures and important pollinators in their own right, just as much as our butterflies. These are a bunch of different species that I found here in my backyard in Massachusetts. But in order to have this amazing diversity of moths, you need to support the caterpillars. And so you need to provide the plants that these caterpillars need to feed on, which is when these moths spend most of their life cycle in this form. For moths and butterflies, there is an amazing number of diversity of species. So in Massachusetts, we actually have over 2,200 different species of butterflies and moths, but they're not distributed randomly across plants. We see that there are particular plants that support the majority of the diversity. So these are numbers actually for Massachusetts. So if you do live up here, oaks are supporting 477 caterpillar species, cherries at 415, willows at 406, tremendous diversity. And of course, herbaceous plants support fewer caterpillar species, but still a lot in their own right. So some of those power players are things like goldenrod, asters, our native strawberry, our sunflowers, and our smartweed. All of these are wonderful additions to your yard that will also support a large amount of caterpillar diversity. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a whole slew of non-native plants and some native plants that don't support very much caterpillar diversity at all. So we have lilacs at 26. And honestly, for a non-native plant, 26 is pretty darn good. That's pretty much at the high end of the spectrum. We have things like ginkgo. They only support 6 caterpillar species. We have elms that are, Japanese elms that aren't known to support any caterpillar species at all. And so it's very clear that in order to get your most bang for your buck in terms of restoring butterfly and moth populations, we really need to prioritize those native plants that are supporting most of the diversity. And so in these numbers, I also want to mention that these non-native plants are plants that are not native to North America. But we've done a lot of research on these data sets. We've accumulated these gigantic data sets of plant to caterpillar interactions. And we actually see that across all of the plants that are in the United States, all of the plant genera, I should say, is that just 14% of the plants support more than 90% of the butterfly and moth species across the entire United States. And it doesn't matter if you're in Massachusetts or in Florida or if California or Washington, there's a few key players that are really doing the lion's share of supporting that diversity. And in our data set, we found that the top genera were oaks, willows, cherries, pines, and poplars, all deciduous trees that are these real power plants that will maximize our ability to restore caterpillar diversity. So I'm saying a lot about butterflies and moths and their caterpillars, but I can assure you they're not the only specialists that are out there. There are lots of insects that are also specialists, from our flower flies, which are important pollinators that I'm sure you've seen visiting your flowers. Our beetles can be specialists in both as adults and in their larval forms. And many folks are surprised to learn that our bees can also be pollen specialists, where they only feed particular pollen to feed their brood. And so, you know, I'm an ecologist, so I want numbers. So I went out and looked for them, and I have them for you here. And so in the eastern United States, more than 30% of our native bees are considered pollen specialists. And that works out to be about 120 of our specialist species in the eastern United States. And when you look at how these bees are doing, our specialist bees are the ones that are in the strongest decline. So we really want to do what we can to plant the plants that these bees need. And when we look at the database, and I got this from the native bee monitoring lab at the United States Geological Service, a lot of times plant bee interact specializations are one plant to one bee, but I was able to pull out some of those plants for you that were supporting a couple dozen species. And so we see things like goldenrods at 34 species, sunflowers, asters, black-eyed Susans. If we're prioritizing these plants for native bees, we're going to support more of our specialist bees as well as the generalist as well. And you'll also notice that many of these plants that are great for bees are also the ones that are great for caterpillars. So again, we can really get our bang for our buck if we're trying to select species that belong in these particular groups of plants. And again, I want to emphasize that when you plant for our specialist bees, you'll get the generalist pollinators as well. And our specialists are the ones that are in the strongest decline. I just want to put another plug for another thing that you can do to help bees is to embrace your lazy lawnmower. And so a colleague of mine here in Massachusetts had done a wonderful study where she found that if you switched from mowing your lawn once a week to just once every other week, that small change would increase the number of flowers that are in your yard, which would also increase the number of bees that your yard supports. And she found that when you reduce that mowing, a lot of the plants that came up, she found 40 to 50% of those species were native spontaneous plants that were wonderful for bees and just needed less of the mowing regime to happen for them to come up and start supporting our pollinator diversity. And if you're wondering why I'm talking so much about insects, I just want to emphasize that our insects are incredibly important and they supply a lot of important ecosystem services that we benefit from, such as pollination, but also pest control and soil fertilization. And as a gardener or a landscaper, it's in your best interest to support healthy populations of beneficial native insects, because when we have that stable ecosystem, our plants are going to be healthier and more beautiful too. However, if that wasn't enough evidence for you, if you're still sitting there and you're thinking, you know what, Desiree, I just really don't care about insects. That's not something that I'm interested in. Now I want to share with you a little bit of evidence for why the plants that you select might matter from our songbird perspective. And the reason for that is really pretty simple. Birds eat insects, surprise. In fact, insects are incredibly important for supporting our native bird populations. But again, I wanted to find that data, so I've got that for you here. In fact, in the United States, we know that at least 440 bird species eat insects, at least in some point in the annual cycle. And in fact, across the globe, more than 70% of our songbirds eat more than 50% of their diet is insects. And the reason for this is that our insects are highly nutritious power packages of food. And this is really important during critical life stages, such as breeding, when you're feeding young. And we see again and again that some insects, like our caterpillars, are disproportionately preferred by our songbirds because they have high protein, which is really important for growing bones and for growing feathers. They have high calories, which makes them really efficient, little power packet of food to go out and find to feed your young. And lastly, they have really high carotenoids, which are important for immune function and for the bird's health, but also for producing those beautiful plumages like the red in a northern cardinal. And again, I want to emphasize that birds are not only beautiful, amazing, and culturally relevant to many people, they're also important components of ecosystems. They serve many roles, including predators, pollinators, scavengers, seed dispersal, nutrient transporters, ecosystem engineers. They're just amazing creatures that we need to have in our life. And there's a wonderful quote by a scientist named Tom Lovejoy that said, if you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. And I love that quote and I completely subscribe to it. We need to protect our bird populations. And so in this way, our bird conservation is intimately connected to insect conservation. And our insect conservation is then built on the foundation of those plant communities that we cultivate. And so those seemingly small decisions that you make in your garden, such as where to plant a tree or what kind, can have far-reaching impacts on our food webs. But we have surprisingly little information to help us in our decision-making, which is where my research really fits in. This is the challenge that I'm trying to tackle. And so one of the major decisions that I've studied is whether to plant native or non-native plant species. And this is a major decision that people are making. Historically, most plant choices were made based on how pretty a plant is or how easy it is to maintain, but there's increasing interest in prioritizing plants that also are serving ecological function. And asking this question is not trivial. Non-native plants are extremely common in horticulture, and especially in urban areas where these non-native plant, evolutionary non-native plant species can make up the majority of the plant biomass. And so if we want to improve these areas for biodiversity, we really need to ask the question of whether these non-native plants are the ecological equivalent of our native species. And so I decided to ask this question within a study system in the Washington, D.C. area with the help of a large team of over 200 different householders across the metropolitan area. And we were really interested in whether if yards were landscaping with non-native plants, does this have any consequences for our native birds and insects? And so some of the research I'm going to share with you today that we tackled is from the perspective of the Carolina chickadee, which is a common nest box using bird that you may have seen in your yard or you may have seen on a Christmas card. They're a wonderful species for asking this question because they're very common, they're charismatic, people like them, but they're also primarily insectivorous. And so during the breeding season, more than 95% of their diet is composed of insects. And so if non-native plants are affecting insects, then this could also have cascading effects for this insect-eating bird. And so what we did is we went out to these participating yards, these householders that had volunteered their properties, and we put up these PVC nest boxes to attract the birds to nest. And then we were fortunate that our volunteers monitored these boxes for breeding activity, which then freed up the time for us to collect lots of different other data on the territory. And so we could collect very fine scale information about plant communities and insects that were found on those plants so that we could quantify not just the biomass of non-native plants in that bird's territory, but also the communities and biomass of insects that they were supporting. And so for the purposes of this study, you always need to define what you mean by non-native. And so for this study, we defined something that was native as a plant that had a natural distribution that included the eastern United States. So a pretty broad definition. And so what we did is in these yards, we monitored our boxes, but of course we recognize that birds are not, they don't have to use this nest box. We need to travel all around the neighborhood to make sure that they're not just nesting in a tree or in someone's yard or something like that. And so that led us into some interesting situations like this one, where we had a bird that was nesting in a newspaper slot for 3 years in a row, 3 years that this bird nested successfully in a newspaper slot. And so it really provides some evidence that if the food is there and the plants are there, that these birds will really find a way. And so one of the questions that we asked was, do these native plants, these plants that are native to the eastern United States, do they provide more food and foraging opportunities for our Carolina chickadees? And so what we found is that yes, overwhelmingly so, our native plants were supporting much higher caterpillar biomass compared to the non-native plants. And myself and colleagues have done numerous studies looking at this, and we find that on average, the native plants are supporting 2 to 3 times more food and more than 5 times the number of species. And that often the trees that support the most caterpillar species are also supporting the most caterpillar biomass for birds to eat. So those two metrics are strongly correlated with one another. And we've actually done studies that have gone beyond these caterpillars to other arthropods, such as spiders and ants and katydids and all kinds of things. And we see that most insect taxa are in higher abundances on native plants. And the only things that are more abundant on non-natives are things like scale insects, aphids, and other sort of pests that gardeners don't actually want on their plants anyway, and birds don't really want to eat because they're not very nutritious at all. The other thing that we found, we also did a side study looking at cultivars. So these are plants that have been selectively bred in horticulture, and we see lots of native cultivars that have variegation or disease resistance or more fruiting or enhanced fall color. And what we found is that even these artificially selected native plants, they're still supporting similar caterpillar communities similar communities to the native wild types of plants. And that the only trait that supported fewer caterpillars and fewer species of caterpillars were plants that were selectively bred for red leaves. And we think that that's because these plants, when they're selectively bred for red color, have more of those nasty chemical compounds in the leaf that deter the insects to use them. So that's not good for birds either. So great, our native plants have more food for birds, but the next question is whether the birds can actually perceive that. And so in order to ask this question, we really let the birds tell us what trees that they like to feed on. And so we used a technique that's called color banding, where we actually capture the birds very safely. We apply these plastic color bands to their legs so that we can identify them with our binoculars. And so I can say, oh, hey, this is blue yellow. I know him. He's a male. He is nesting in that yard. He has 6 babies in his nest. He's 3 years old. And these are the trees that he likes to forage on to feed his young. And so when we go out and do those behavioral observations, we can make these really cool maps of activity of the bird. So this is one bird in a yard in the middle of Washington, D.C. The star here is where that bird nested. So, and the darker color is where he spent most of his time. And so you can see that he spent most of his time in a black cherry that was in the yard that he was nesting in. He went to the neighbor's yard. He ate from a sweet gum. And then he went along the street trees and he took advantage of the elm cultivars and the willow oaks. And then he went across the neighborhood a little bit and chowed down in a black walnut that some neighbor had let go crazy. And so you can see that for this bird and for many that we studied, they're using very selected foraging on particular plant species. And they're ignoring a lot of the plant biomass and the green space that's in the landscape. So what are they avoiding? And the answer is they're avoiding non-native plants. We found that our birds overwhelmingly chose to forage on native plants. Over 95% of our observations were in native plants. And we see that they strongly avoided the non-native plants and almost never used them. It was like they were just, a statue in the landscape. But what I think is really interesting about our data is that we found that the number of caterpillar species that a plant supports, and this was derived from the literature from this database that we had amassed, the number of caterpillar species that a plant supports strongly is related to how much that bird likes to forage in that plant. And so trees like oaks that support more than 500 different species of caterpillars in the Washington, D.C. area are strongly preferred by chickadees. And we see this really great linear relationship. And the relationship is much weaker in our non-native plants, suggesting that they're really just unreliable for food. And why I think this is really important is because when I got these results, I offered this number of caterpillars on a particular plant as a potential quantitative metric that we could use to help us select between different plants. So if you had a couple of different plants that you have to choose from, we have lots of different traits that we have to keep into account, like shade and money and our soil, and maybe you want a tree with pink flowers. But once you've narrowed down the plants that you can select from, now you can use this metric as a means to make relative comparisons among species in terms of their ability to provide food for insect-eating birds. And in fact, this data is available for you. You can use it. If you go on the National Wildlife Federation website, they have a native plant finder. Here's the website here. And you can plug in your zip code. You can get lists of native plants for your area, but you can also get that number of caterpillar species that are associated with the plant. So you can choose plants that are great for birds. You can also back search by the butterfly or the moth. So if there's a particular species that you're interested in hosting in your garden, like the Eastern tiger swallowtail, you can look them up. You can find out what kind of host plants that you can use in your area. So it's a really great resource. It's in beta mode, so we're still adding information to it, but at least for the time being, it's something that you can use in your decision making. And another resource that you might want to check out is the Audubon Society's Native Plant Finder or Native Plant database as well. And that's another one where you can plug in your zip code and you can get lists of appropriate plants for your area. I also want to emphasize that while we were studying these chickadees, so they breed in the springtime. And when they're breeding and raising their young, it's also spring migration, which is when many of our songbirds are migrating thousands and thousands of miles from the places that they spent the winter up to the places where they're going to breed. And so the same trees where we were finding our chickadees foraging were also covered in amazing colors and jewels of warblers and vireos and tanagers and orioles and all this other amazing bird diversity. In fact, by the end of the study, we had documented more than 50 different species of migratory birds that were using residential yards on stopover during migration, and more than 20 different species of warbler. And these included numerous declining species and species of conservation concern that were heavily using urban yards in order to find food. And so these are birds that don't necessarily breed in urban areas, but providing habitat for them while they're making their journeys is incredibly critical for their populations. And so, what I would ask of you is that when you think about how you can create habitat for birds in your yards, is to not just think about the cardinals and the doves and the chickadees that you might see on a day-to-day basis, but think about how we can cultivate a real habitat highway from the Arctic North to the Amazon through the way that you plant bird-friendly native plants. Because the plants that provide food for these birds while they make these amazing journeys could be really life or death for these species. And we know that they really use urban areas a lot. So it behooves us to provide food for them while they're there. So for the last part of this talk, I want to do a little thought exercise for you. So take a moment and think about this little tiny bird here, our Carolina chickadee again, and think, how many caterpillars do you think that it takes to raise a nest of chickadees? Get a number in your head, think about it. And whatever that number is, I'm gonna guess it might be wrong. The answer is lots. It takes lots of caterpillars to raise just one clutch of chickadees. In fact, our bird scientists have actually gotten those numbers for you. And in the 60s, they found that for one nest of chickadees, those birds were bringing from 300 to 500 caterpillars per day. Those services those birds are providing are tremendous. They're really keeping those insects from eating your plant so that you don't see them, but they're really bringing that many caterpillars back to their plant, to their young. And for the Carolina chickadee, they feed their young for 16 days before they fledge. And so if you think about it, if you extrapolate up, that means that to raise one nest of chickadees, it takes from 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars just for one nest of 6 little tiny birds. And a Carolina chickadee weighs 10 grams. So picture 10 paper clips sitting in your hand. And so now that you have that to think about how many caterpillars might it take to raise that cardinal that you see, or the blue jay, or the woodpecker, these birds that are tremendously bigger than our chickadee. It takes a lot of food. And so then the other question that we asked in this study is, are there consequences if non-native plants are abundant? So if the birds can't find food, what does that mean? Does it have any impacts at the population level? And in order to monitor populations, we have to collect a lot of different data. It's a lot of work. So I was fortunate to have help from those community scientists that were volunteering their time. So we were able to collect data on reproduction. So this is how many eggs did a bird lay, how many young fledged. And with the help of our volunteers, we were able to get a sense for how well that those pairs of chickadees were reproducing. We also have to get a sense for adult survival. So how well are the females surviving from year to year in order to make additional nests? And for that data, we used a 16-year data set of going out and looking for those color-banded birds, seeing if they came back to their same territories. And again, with the help of these volunteers, we were able to estimate that. And then finally, we had to get some sense of juvenile survival. So this is birds that have left the nest, but their parents are still taking care of them. How well are they surviving until they can have their own territories? It turns out that monitoring little baby birds after they leave the nest is really hard. So we actually had to use tracking technology with little antennas to actually go out and tag these birds and then follow them around the landscape. And we were able to make these really cool maps that really show that it takes a village, it takes a neighborhood to raise a nest of chickadees. Here, this tiny circle is where the nest was, but they ended up going 1, 2, and 3 kilometers away from that nest in order to find food once those birds were able to fly. And so it put us in some really interesting situations, such as visiting a gas station, the local Sunoco, looking for baby birds that were using the trees. And so what we found from this study is that as non-native plants increase, the number of young or fledglings that the birds are producing strongly declines as those non-native plants increase. We found negative effects on whether the birds selected those areas to breed and also on how many young that survived to leave the nest. We found no effects on survival, but that really kind of makes sense for this species because they do use feeders after they're done breeding, and they use them heavily in the winter when most of the mortality is occurring. So it does appear that most of the negative effects of non-native plants are happening when these birds are stuck in one location to feed their young. So now that we have all that data, we can plug that into a population growth equation. And here I just want to orient you to this real quick. So here on this dashed line is 0, that's considered replacement. So that means that birds are producing enough young to sustain a local population. And if there's a positive number, they're increasing. If there's a negative number, they're declining. And so you would suspect that a stable population would fluctuate around 0. And so what we found is that as non-native plants increase, that population growth strongly declined. And we found that the point at which non-native or at which population growth doesn't overlap 0 anymore, which is right here, was at 30% non-native plants. And so we offered that as a threshold that people can aim for. That if you can get less than 30% non-native plants, or in other words, 70% native plants, then the birds have at least some chance of sustaining a local population. But once you get over that 30%, the chances of that happening are virtually negligible. And so I was actually pretty optimistic when I saw these results because for this system, 55% was our average amount of non-native plants. And so if you think about it, asking people to aim for 30% is kind of a gentle nudge in the right direction towards improving our landscapes for insect-eating birds. But in other areas that we studied, such as new residential developments and in commercial areas, non-native plants can be 80 to 90% of the plant biomass. And so in order to create habitat for insect-eating birds in these areas, that's going to require a more drastic change to our preferences and to our landscaping styles. And of course, to support our more sensitive species like our migratory birds, we're probably going to have to aim lower, but this at least gives us a starting point to aim for. If you're wondering what does 70% native plant biomass means, I'm going to give you a little demonstration here. So with the average amount of trees and shrubs that were in our system in an average size yard of about a half an acre or so, or a quarter acre, I'm sorry, getting to 70% native plant biomass would mean planting 4 to 5 large trees of a 50-centimeter diameter, or 7 to 8 medium-sized trees of a 25-centimeter diameter, or 15 to 16 small trees or shrubs of a 10-centimeter diameter. Any of these combinations will get you to that point. But of course, that's just 1 yard, and we know that these birds are using a much larger area. So that means we also need to have buy-in from our neighbors as well. And so I encourage you, if you learned something today, if you're inspired to create habitat for insect-eating birds, talk to your neighbors, get them on board, share this information of why native plants matter. And the more that we can scale up from 1 yard to many yards, the more potential that we have to create high quality habitat for insect eating birds in our urban and suburban landscapes. And so just to sum up what I've shared with you today, I know I shared a lot of information, but I hope that you took something home. And these are the key points that I want you to remember. Number one, I want you to remember that plants vary in their contributions to species interactions, and that there are some plants that are really the power players of supporting biodiversity. And so if we prioritize those in our gardening and our landscaping, we have a better chance of more efficient and effective restoration. I also want to emphasize that native birds and insects strongly prefer native plants because of those co-evolutionary relationships. And so if you prioritize native plants in your landscaping, you're more likely to support native wildlife. And that if you landscape with a large amount of native plants and aim for that 70+% in your yard, you have a much stronger chance of supporting our insectivorous bird populations, which are in strong decline. And so you'll really be making an effort to support our birds, both the ones that are breeding in your yard, but also the ones that are just moving through along the way. And so in the end, I shared with you a lot of information about my research, and I was able to answer my question. I did, demonstrate that native plants are providing that foundation for a functional food web. We did get evidence to support that hypothesis. But what I really want you to take home, what we really demonstrated here is that your yard matters, like Sarah said before, and that those simple choices that you make in your day-to-day landscaping can have far-reaching implications for biodiversity. And so by prioritizing ecological interactions in your gardening and your landscaping, you can create not just beautiful gardens and habitat, but also functional ecosystems as well. And so I encourage you to do that. And so here's your homework. I want you to go home. I want you to take a look at your yard and see just what a tremendous and wonderful ecosystem that you've cultivated. And if you'd like some help identifying the plants and animals, I encourage you to check out this website called iNaturalist, which is a wonderful resource for exploring what is in your area, as well as you can upload photos from your cell phone and you can crowdsource identifications from local experts and naturalists. And so once you get to know those plant and animal neighbors that you're sharing your yard with, then you can start to think about what are the next steps that you can take to start to share your home with all the wildlife that's around you. And so with that, that's all I've got for you today. If you would like to download any of my papers, you can find them on my website, which is here for you. If you have any questions, I encourage you, reach out, email me. You can also find me on Twitter, #PlantsForWildlife. I hope that you learned something today. I hope you're thinking about how you can make changes. And thank you so much for your attention today. And I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Narango. We have a couple of questions already coming in. The first is, as the sugar maple trees become less abundant in southern New England, will the caterpillars that use that tree as a host plant adapt to other trees, or will they become rare in this area?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is that it depends. It depends on the species. And so, like I mentioned before, specialism can vary from using one species of plant to one genus of plant to one family of plant to lots of different families of plants. And so for the caterpillars that use maple and that really like to use sugar maple, some of them might be totally fine and just switch to red maple or some other maple that's in the landscape. In fact, congeneric non-natives can sometimes support caterpillars that eat maple as well. But for some of our most specialized species, they could suffer some consequences for that. And it could be that the species is still around, but the population just declines. And so they're occurring in lower abundances than they normally would, which might have cascading effects to food webs. So it's in our best interest to try to retain as much as we can those native plants that are native to the local ecosystems.
Thank you. We have a couple of more technical questions that I might encourage people to reach out directly to Desiree with, and I might move to some of the more general ones. I'll also note we have a question here about doesn't Smith have a lot of non-native non-native plant and trees in the botanical garden? And I would say the answer to that is yes. In fact, the reason we invited Dr. Narango here is because her research has already been inspiring us to think about how we replace those non-native species with native species. So that's a very good question, and we're learning along with you quite a bit. The next question from an, from an audience member is, what about the use of pesticides in our yards? How does that affect the birds' health?
Sure. So for the purposes of the study that I shared with you today, we purposefully, we used very selective recruitment. And so we needed to make sure a couple of things about those yards. One was that they weren't feeding insect food like mealworms. So all those people were out. The other thing we wanted to make sure is that they weren't using widespread pesticides. So we avoided neighborhoods where we knew that they were spraying trees. We contacted local arborists to make sure that they weren't doing that. We also didn't use anyone that was spraying for mosquitoes. We couldn't control for small uses of spot pesticides, but at least for widespread pesticide use, we were able to avoid including those yards in our data set. And the nice thing is when you make relationships with people, they tell you like when things are happening so that you can try to account for that to the best of your ability. To answer your question though, I mean, pesticides aren't good for insects. And as much as we want to target, I mean, we're using them to target these pests that might be overrunning your plant or something, but they're killing everything, and they're also going out into the ecosystem, and so it's also killing the beneficial insects as well, and so that's not good for birds. There's studies of landscape scale pesticide use that finds negative effects on birds behaviorally, on their condition, at the population level. We want to really try to reduce our pesticides to when we absolutely have to use them and for a targeted basis. So I'm not saying we can't use them ever, because sometimes you have to use them to make sure that the tree lives, but we want to use as little as possible. We want to use something that's as safe as possible and not use this widespread pesticide use just willy-nilly. And the other thing I want to emphasize is there's this really great scientist at University of Maryland, and he did this wonderful study looking at beneficial native predators, predatory insects, I should say. And what he found is when you increased the amount of shrubbery in your yard, you get more of those beneficial arthropods like ladybugs and lacewings and those predatory insects that are keeping those pest populations down. And that you could actually have a better effect by incorporating beneficial predatory insects than spraying pesticides, because you had a more stable, healthy ecosystem instead of killing the insects and having them bounce back all the time. So that's something to think about, but a long-winded way of saying, yes, pesticides are not good for birds because they need the insects to eat.
Good. We've got lots of really good questions here, more than
Oh,
we're
great,
going to
great.
be able to get through in the next 5 minutes. I think this might be the last one. The question is, you focused on deciduous species. What is the effect of native evergreens, pines, hemlocks, and spruces?
Sure. So it turns out that a lot of our deciduous trees are supporting a lot of insects, and like, you know, our oaks are very important. But one of our best plants from our big national wide comparison was pines. And so our conifers also support a lot of caterpillars and other arthropods, but then they also vary too. And so pines are supporting more than hemlocks, which are supporting more than junipers, and it just really depends. But we have that, you know, that information is available for you, so you can make those comparisons, because some conifers are great, some conifers are not so good. I will tell you that out of all of those different groups that we've talked about, non-native conifers are the worst out of all. So those are the ones that you really want to avoid, for at least the worst for supporting insects for birds.
Maybe I'll squeeze one more in here, which is a question which resonates with me from Jennifer. What about poison ivy? Does it support anything? I think the question is here, do we have to feel bad about removing it from our yards?
Oh, I love that question. I really do. So poison ivy is a native plant. It does support native insects. It supports a lot of birds, also because it produces fruit in the fall, which is why it disperses all over the place. And so from a bird's perspective, it's a good plant, and it's natural. It's supposed to be there. It's not like Oriental bittersweet, and it is a vine, so it's aggressive. And so I want to emphasize that you should never feel bad about also prioritizing your needs as well. And we can do those both synergistically. So if you don't want poison ivy in your yard, that is totally okay. You can control that. We can find maybe a tamer, less aggressive and less skin irritating vine or another tree that will do just as well as that poison ivy. And so you know, it's totally okay for you to also consider your personal and cultural preferences. And so as an ecologist, I want to make that easier for you to make that decision.
Well, thank you.
Get rid of all of it.
Well, for everyone who didn't have a question answered, please do feel free to reach out to Dr. Narango at dnarango@gmail.com. You can also use Twitter. I want to thank you once again for attending, for taking time, spending time with us this evening. A link to the recording of this event will be available shortly on our website, garden.smith.edu. Please do remember to follow us on social media as well for updates on the bulb show, which again opens on Saturday. And good night and be well.
Thank you so much.